Hopefully you've learned a lot about antenna types. Now we're going to look at what is called beamforming. Beamforming is different ways to get a beam of signal from a system. Now that may seem kind of simple. We've actually already learned about one of them. The first is called static beamforming. Static beamforming is really what we've already discussed, which is multiple antenna elements designed for the purpose or put into a specific configuration in order to transmit a beam of signal. Now we've already seen that. We've seen that in semi-directional antennas and directional antennas and even sectors. So nothing new there, but it is important to understand that is what's called a type of beamforming. A cooler type, maybe the most complicated one to explain, is called transmit beamforming. That is abbreviated TXBF, transmit beamforming. Transmit beamforming was introduced to Wi-Fi in 802.11n. It is further perfected and actually become a reality in 802.11ac. But what is it? Let's look at, have you ever heard of noise-canceling headphones? Probably. You've seen the commercials, how you can be on an airplane, you can turn it on, and all of a sudden the engine noise goes away. What is happening there is those headphones have an antenna. They have a microphone on them, and they're actually listening to the outside noise, the jet engine noise. And what they're doing is then they're transmitting what's called negative sound. Let's say this is the jet engine noise. What they are transmitting, the actual headphones will transmit the opposite into your ear. What that does is it actually nullifies the sound. It actually makes it less. Now you may be wondering, well, that's pretty cool. Does it really work that well? Sort of. The one thing it can't do, just because electronics are not perfectly fast, they're not instant, even though they're just measured in millionths of a second, they're not instant, is you may be wondering, well, why cannot that mute my kids or that baby that's on the plane? The reason it can't is because by the time the microphone hears it, it can't transmit the inverse because the sound has already gotten to your ears. So basically, it's a timing problem. But constant noises, like jet engine noise, it will actually transmit the opposite. Now, two signals that are exactly the opposite, the result of those two signals is what's called a null, or nothing. They cancel each other out. That's why, if you've ever used it, you can put those headphones on. Oh, it's kind of noisy. Turn them on. Whew, that's nice. What happens if there is the opposite? Now we're not talking about the jet engine anymore. What happens if you have two signals that are the same? If you have two signals that are exactly the same and they get to your ears at the same time, what do you get? You actually get the opposite. Instead of canceling it out, you actually get gain. Two of them equals 3 decibels of gain, twice the power. You should know that by now. If you were to have 3 of them that go together, you actually get plus 4.77 dBs of gain. So you're actually getting more gain the more that you can put these together. So transmit beamforming is the ability to have multiple signals work together to increase the resulting signal. This is also known as constructive interference. Well, how would that work? Let's look at a very simple access point. Let's just say we're looking top down on an access point. This access point has 2 antennas. We'll call it antenna 1 and antenna 2. When this transmits, if it is possible for it to get to a client device, we'll say it's your phone, if it can get to your client device in such a way where the signals are perfectly in sync, then we can actually beamform. We can actually get more signal. The first thing, though, when this phone transmits to this access point, does it make sense to you? Do you believe me that the signal actually hits antenna 2 before it gets to antenna 1? Yes. It's measured in millionths of a second. It's very, very small amount of time difference, but it is a time difference. Now think about this in reverse. If we had an access point, we wanted it to transmit to this phone two of the same signal. Again, we want this and we want this. Two of the same signal to arrive at this phone at the same time, what would we have to do? Well, you can kind of imagine what we'd have to do. What's going to happen is the signal will actually come out of antenna number 1 first, and then out of antenna number 2, with the result being perfectly synchronized when it gets to the receiver. As you can imagine, if this phone was over here, it would time it differently, or if it was over here, it could time it differently. So that's cool. This is also known as a phased array. This was new to Wi-Fi and 802.11n, but the thought behind this transmit beamforming, has been used for decades. It's actually even used on radar as well. You can actually send signals in different directions just by shifting this time. Pretty cool stuff. Transmit beamforming, pretty simple. If we were to add a third antenna, it does the same thing. It has a few caveats. One of them is, if you can imagine this timing being perfect for this phone, the exact pattern for that phone is actually also reflected in a way. That's kind of a bad word to use maybe, but that same timing that comes from these two antennas also sends the same strong beamformed signal over here. Well, that's kind of a waste. It's actually not great to do that. It's actually noise. There's nothing you can do about that with standard transmit beamforming now. The idea is, well, the gain from this is probably better than not having the gain at all. And we would agree with that. So that is transmit beamforming. This is all done what's called chip-based beamforming. This is all done in a radio chip that you would get in any new access point. 11n had multiple types of transmit beamforming. Suffice it to say, no one implemented it. Cisco actually tried with a technology called Client Link. It used what's called implicit beamforming. The implicit versus explicit is really about the information you get from your phone. Now, this may not translate to everyone, but have you ever heard of the game Marco Polo? It's a kid's game where I say Marco, the kids say Polo. I have my eyes closed and I'm trying to find them, usually in a pool or something. So Marco Polo, when I say Marco, I get this feedback from people, and then I can try to find them. Implicit beamforming was like playing Marco Polo with no one responding. So if I just say Marco and nobody says anything, how do I know where to point? How do I know where to walk? I may get lucky, just like implicit beamforming could, but the reality is it was never perfect. What was standardized upon in 11AC was something called explicit beamforming. Explicit beamforming is like playing Marco Polo, but when I say Marco, the kid says 2 meters ahead, 1 meter to the left, and 20 degrees offset. Right? Very detailed. It actually gives some channel information that says, all right, your beam is a little off, make this shift. So it's cool technology. Again, standardized and now implemented in 11AC. So not only was it standardized, just like 11N was standardized, but now we actually have a real implementation of it. Another, and our last type of beamforming to discuss, is called an adaptive array. So it's not transmit beamforming, but you could call it some sort of a form of beamforming. An adaptive array looks like this. It's just, imagine an access point with a whole bunch of different transmitters in it, maybe even at different polarizations. Now today, this is only done by one company called Ruckus Wireless. This adaptive array, what it does is the best way to describe it is a dynamic directional antenna. We learned about directional antennas. It sends a signal only one direction. The problem with a directional antenna is it only goes one direction. What this adaptive array does, the adaptive array actually creates antennas based on what the client device needs. So let's say we have this phone over here, and the system may choose to use, 3 elements, I don't know, making this up, 3 elements that form a particular signal type for that client. And then the next packet, 10 seconds later, 1/100th of a second later, this next client over here, which may be a laptop, may get a completely different signal designed for it. And again, that's called an adaptive array. This is proprietary in the sense that Ruckus is the only one that does it. It is standard in the sense that it works with every device out there. So, advantages of this, you get the signal extra signal, which is always good. We're going to learn that signal equals speed. You get the extra signal without the problems you have with transmit beamforming. That extra reflected signal, you have to have the client support for that Marco Polo channel sounding algorithm we talked about. So this is standard. This works on basically every device out there. And the other cool thing is adaptive arrays with Ruckus and transmit beamforming can actually work in conjunction with each other. Super duper extra signal, which hopefully translates into extra performance. So hopefully this gives you a great idea into beamforming. We talked about static, which is basically antenna design for one directional array. We talked about transmit beamforming as multiple signals that get to the receiver at the same time, what's called in phase with each other. And those two signals create constructive interference, and adaptive arrays, which use multiple antenna components dynamically to create static antenna gain.